Joining us, the president, I believe that's his title, of the Institute for Reforming Government. CJ Safer joins us. Good morning, CJ.
Steve, Carol, good morning. Happy Tuesday.
Yeah, what's your happy thing? What's your positive thing for the day?
The positive thing is I just saw my parents for the first time in about 11 months.
That's awesome.
Very excited about that. Just another sign that, we're back. It's the reopening. And, of course, the Bucks swept the Heat. So we are ready to rock and roll.
Look at you dropping a positive
I know,
story.
right?
I love that. See,
Yeah.
That's why I love CJ, because he's always bringing some sunshine as well as some serious stuff. All right, let's get to it. The budget process is underway in the state of Wisconsin. I know some of this is dry, but a lot of it is, this really matters to Wisconsinites, taxpayers, residents of the state. So let's recap what we know so far.
Sure, Steve. Appreciate you having on to discuss the updates. And as we've really been discussing since the beginning of the year, so just to recap, the Wisconsin state government is going to spend about $80 billion when they pass a budget this year. And in February, Democrat Governor Tony Evers proposed his budget, and that was kind of like the first move. And it was a really big progressive budget. Think like, Joe Biden-esque, where just chock full of progressive policies, over $1 billion in tax hikes, and, unprecedented spending in about every category your listeners can think of. Then the next step is the proposed budget goes to the legislature, in particular the Joint Finance Committee. The Joint Finance Committee, like the legislature itself, is dominated by Republicans. And what the Finance Committee did, the first thing they pulled out, they pretty much gutted Evers' budget. They said that they're going to start over from base, which is basically taking the last budget that both sides agreed upon, and so we're going to build on top of that. And away we go. And now every few weeks or every week they'll be adding to it or taking stuff out based upon certain categories.
Now,
last Thursday, go ahead, Steve.
No. I was just keep going. I was going to ask you about education and how Evers' budget is affecting education in the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah, well, so Governor Tony Evers' proposed budget for K-12, it would gut school choice programs. So it was going to be having limits on school vouchers, limits on charter schools. And then on top of that, it would have about unprecedented 18% increase in K-12 spending. The last Thursday, the Joint Finance Committee met, and they met to talk about K-12 and higher ed and to vote on what they think the legislature's budget should be for those two issues. And for K-12, the best way to think about what the Republicans on Joint Finance were doing was they want to decrease state spending as much as possible and backfill the decrease with federal money. A big development happened between basically now and then when Evers proposed his budget, and that was the federal government in Washington, D.C., and President Biden passing the American Rescue Plan, which, as we've talked about, sends billions and billions to the states. Wisconsin, for K-12, is getting over $2 billion in federal funding, primarily in the name of COVID relief, but a lot of this is going to be going for a whole host of different things. And what Republicans on JFC were talking about last week, they're saying, well, we have to be responsible, and when we spend state dollars, we need to take into account over $2 billion influx of federal cash that's coming in specifically for K-12.
But what happens, CJ, is the Department of Education says, hold on a second. We may not give you that funding if you do this. And what do you make of that threat?
Yeah, coincidentally, the Department of Education, and they were incredibly quick. For anyone that's dealt with the Department of Ed, they thought that was kind of fascinating. Department of Education in D.C. Fired off a letter saying, well, not so fast. There's something called maintenance of effort, and that's a really complicated term to basically mean if you're going to take all this federal money, you can't decrease the state spending, so much so that you're just backfilling it with federal dollars.
What do you make of that? What do you make of that threat?
Well, I mean, look, so the co-chair, Howard Markline of Joint Finance, said this risk is manageable, saying, look, the Department of Education, this is bureaucratic speak, that if you're giving us all this federal money, we're going to spend it how we best see fit. And, oh, by the way, this isn't just a problem that's unique to Wisconsin. All 50 states are going to have some sort of issues because you're giving us this over $2 billion in federal money. We want to make sure that Wisconsin taxpayers aren't spending more than we have to on K-12. But then you're getting Democrats that are saying just the opposite. Senator Erpenbach from Madison at the finance hearing on Thursday, he said that, look, I mean, what Republicans are doing is dishonest, that their funding level is so low that the feds are just going to pull back all of their federal dollars. What I make of it is it's a little bit of bureaucratic speak with incredibly high stakes.
Well, exactly. Exactly. The stakes are high. And if, let's just put it this way, if the Joint Finance Committee and the legislature goes forward without any evidence or any proof that this money will still be there, that's a huge risk politically and just budget-wise.
It is, and I would say this represents a problem, though, right? This is why a lot of us that believe in more power to the states and less power to Washington, D.C., get very concerned, right? So you have the Department of Education basically now interfering in what we can both agree is that a fairly complicated budget battle between the governor and the legislature of different parties. And now you have the Department of Education jumping in and saying, well, you want to use this federal money, you can't be, you have to spend a certain amount on K-12. You can't be putting it towards the rainy day fund, which is what Republicans want to do. The Wisconsin Nonpartisan Fiscal Bureau essentially interpreted the Department of Education letter to say that the state has to spend 35% of its budget on K-12 in order to be compliant with what the Department of Education is asking.
CJ Safer joining us on WTMJ. Real quick, I wanted to ask you about the other idea that came out of this, which actually surprised me, was the idea of ending the tuition freeze. Good idea, bad idea? What do you think?
Yeah, for higher education, they also took a vote along similar principles. Republicans want to spend significantly less than Evers, and they want to, with now acknowledging that there's all this federal money coming into higher ed, too. But they did something that was very fascinating. Whereas Governor Evers wanted to extend Governor Walker's tuition freeze, the Republicans said it's time for us to have a glide path to end the tuition freeze. And Senator Dale Kuyanga from Wauwatosa and Brookfield, he made the argument that it made sense at the time in 2013 when we had so much in reserves but nothing was being accounted for, that it now is time for us to put the power back in the regions to control tuition. I am very concerned by this. I think that, again, under the same principle that we have all this federal money coming into higher ed, now is not the time to be increasing tuition on families of Wisconsin, especially because before the freeze, we saw tuition that was, would increase over 55% in the last decade. My recommendation, and we're going to be doing some work on this in the coming weeks, is, look, we agree that the tuition freeze can't last forever. But if we're going to be ending it, we need to put on very tight guardrails so, middle-class families in Wisconsin aren't being hurt by rising tuition prices at a time when many families are still reeling.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up to you. Having been a parent who paid very, very much through the nose for sending my kids to college, this is devastating for some families and could quite possibly end any kind of collegiate dream of these kids.
Yeah, State Senator Evan Goyke from Milwaukee made a very similar argument at the hearing. But I have to acknowledge that now there's Democrats making the argument that Governor Walker was making in the last decade. But putting the politics aside,
Yeah, that's an odd one, isn't it?
But look, I mean, to be fair, the tuition freeze can't last forever, right? Because you have to have this thing of we have this product of higher ed that has to be, at least for us that are fiscally conservative, think there has to be a cost to it. And the cost should reflect the product, and just keeping it level may not make sense in the long run. But, I think optimistically, it is a good time then, at least if we want to force a conversation about how are we pricing higher education? How are we charging for online classes? And how are we going to bolster the UW Flex program? And maybe there is a compromise to limit the increase of tuition based upon inflation. But I would be we should be very concerned, and we should watch this very carefully, that tuition is not going to be getting out of control and for at least the next couple of years.
Hey, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, so you've given us kind of a heads up on where we're at right now, some of the big issues, obviously that funding issue, the tuition freeze. What's next in the weeks ahead?
About every week or so, you're going to see Republicans and, the Joint Finance Committee, dominated by Republicans, take on a different part of the budget. This week is going to be workforce development. So obviously, we're going to be talking a little bit later in the week on unemployment insurance. Governor Evers wanted to kind of roll back a number of the Walker Republican reforms. Obviously, they're not going to be agreeing with it. But really, look, this is going to be probably a long, drawn out budget battle. There seems to be a philosophical difference on spending. Governor Evers wants to spend as much as possible. Republicans want to spend the bare minimum of state dollars and backfill it with all this federal money coming in. The budget, usually it's agreed upon, in July-ish. But I think we're going to be seeing a longer, drawn-out debate.
It's interesting that similar to what happened last time, it is going to be drawn out. But eventually, they will get to a budget. Otherwise, we revert to the old budget. So, just real quick, optimistically, will there be surprises? I think you framed it well, right? Conservatives want to spend less. Evers wants to spend more into many of the programs and departments that he likes. What's going to be the net results? And obviously, it's forecasting the future. What do you think?
Well, look, especially when we're talking K-12, there is things, right? So the Republicans did agree to fund some of the things that Evers wanted to, right? So Republicans went in on funding for increases for mental health, increases for special education, increases for transportation, increases for public schools. Not as much as what Evers wanted. I think we're gonna see a few months of trying to understand. Again, it's all about the feds and all this federal money coming in from Washington, D.C. We're going to need to see where schools plan to spend it, where the governor wants to spend some of this money. And then I think what they're going to do is they're going to react accordingly, and it's going to be another bare bones budget that's going to have pretty significant increases, largely based on the federal money coming in.
I appreciate the budget breakdown. That is president of the Institute for Reforming Government, C.J. Safer. We'll do it every couple of weeks. Just kind of get a sense of where this is going to go. Big question marks, especially that federal piece. Thanks as always, C.J.
Thanks, C.J.
Steve, Carol, thank you so much.